For coming. It's been a long and dramatic day with news breaking from Syria and from Stockholm. So thank you for your time, for your attention here at this discussion. My name is Andrea Iannuzzi. I work for Gruppo Editoriale L'Espresso in Italy, which is a for-profit company struggling with revenues like everybody else in the media environment does. Richard Gingras just said that news is what citizens need to be good citizens. But we can't sell news anymore. As a matter of fact, I think that we never sold news. What we were selling was packaging and delivery. When packaging and delivery were core business because people needed them. We can't sell ads in the way Google and Facebook do. And when we try to do it, people block them on their browsers. Can we sell trust? Does trust have an economic value? If the answer is yes, and I don't know if the answer is yes, I hope our speakers could help us to find an answer to this question. So if the answer is yes, are we ready to sell trust? Do we really have something to sell? According to a survey from Ipsos Mori called Veracity Index, hairdressers are far more trustworthy than journalists. So Houston, we have a problem. What we try to do today is try to find a solution. After Trump election and before going to war, in the US there was a boost of funding for non-profit media organization. People realized that a trustworthy news ecosystem is crucial for democracy and decided to activate, to give help, just like we do for environment NGOs or food emergency or homeless people. A couple of days ago, if I am right, eBay founder Piero Midyar committed a $100 million grant to fight the so-called fake news. So is there a light in the dark? Is the non-profit model the future of journalism? Is non-profit sustainable on a large scale? And how could we avoid potential influence from founders or members of a subscription-based community should they have voices in the editorial choices? These are some questions for our speakers today. First, I leave the stage to Molly de Aguiar from the Geraldine Dodge Foundation. In her researches, Molly compared non-profit and for-profit models, focusing in particular on local news environment. So let's listen to what she has found.
Thank you, Andrea. It's such a pleasure to be here, so thank you all for joining us this evening. My name is Molly de Aguiar. I'm a program director with a small private foundation in New Jersey, and we focus statewide on a number of program areas. We fund arts, education, environment, and my program area is called Informed Communities, where we have spent the last 5 or 6 years really building up the infrastructure for local journalism in New Jersey. New Jersey's news landscape is dominated by very small digital newsrooms, 1 or 2 people. A lot of them are journalists who were downsized from a newspaper who went off to start their own site. Some of them are citizens who felt like there was nobody covering their town, and so they stepped up to do it. But by and large, the vast majority of news sources in our state are just these very tiny sites. And so one of the things I want to make sure that I'm clear about is that when I talk about local journalism and business models, I think it's really important to be very precise about scale. I'm not talking about business models for a national newspaper or national television. It's really these very tiny sites and the challenges that they run into every single day. So we've given some support directly to sites in New Jersey, but a lot of what we do is support capacity building for these sites. We helped establish something called the Center for Cooperative Media. It's at a university called Montclair State University, and their whole role in New Jersey is to provide all of the to provide services and training and support for local journalism sites around New Jersey. It's available to any New Jersey journalist. It doesn't matter, if you're you're a journalist in a for-profit newsroom or a nonprofit. It's like they're the hotline that you call if you get a letter from a lawyer and you don't know what to do, or if you need some other kind of referral. So we spent a lot of time building up that center in order to help the entire news ecosystem. And we've also done a lot of experimentation around business models. In partnership with the Knight Foundation, we spent a lot of time really digging deep into what are the daily challenges of these small sites, what keeps them from all the different things, what keeps them from being able to establish new revenue streams, what eats up all of their time. There's a whole lot of sort of human behavior that comes into play here around time management and also being willing to commit to new things, a lot of aversion to risk when you're at such a tiny site and you have very limited resources. So we've spent a lot of time digging into that. We wrote, my colleague Josh Stearns and I wrote a big report about it last year called Lessons Learned from the Local News Lab. So if you're interested, you can read about that. It goes pretty deep on various aspects of the business model for small local sites, what we learned, and it also has a pretty big section on collaboration as well as the role of philanthropy, which is really my perspective as a funder. So we're talking about nonprofit versus for-profit, and I think one of the things that I want to say from my perspective is that nonprofit versus for-profit is just a tax status. It's not a business model, and it's really important not to equate the tax status with your business model. Everybody who is running a news site is running a business, whether those profits go directly to them or they get plowed back into the organization. And I think there are some very clear examples where nonprofits, it makes sense to be a nonprofit. I'll let Scott talk about this more, but obviously investigative journalism makes a lot of sense for it to be a nonprofit, so that you're not accountable to money that you don't want to, that you don't want to be influenced by. I think one other obvious example for us, and I'm sure there are some others, but the other one that jumps to mind for me is in places where like in low-income communities, in places where the local community can't really afford the news but desperately need it, that's a place where philanthropy can step in and make a case for supporting some news source in a place like that in a nonprofit fashion. But I get asked frequently by a lot of the local news sites that we have, I get a lot of questions about, a lot of hand-wringing about should we become a nonprofit? And a lot of times those questions are really motivated by this sort of magical thinking around, if I become a nonprofit, I'm suddenly opening myself up to this world of funding that they think is not available to them as a for-profit. And at least where we are, that's not true. It's a very finite number of funders who fund journalism. And when they ask the question about whether or not they should become nonprofit, they're not at all thinking about everything that comes with all the compliance and governance issues that come with being a nonprofit. It's just this sense of they're missing out on some money that is not available to them. So I tend to recommend against being nonprofit because it's usually coming, the questions are usually coming from that place. The other thing I would note is that because we fund other nonprofits that are not journalism nonprofits, especially I would say in our arts grantees, which is a very sort of, obviously it's a very mature field. We've been funding arts organizations for a long time. I've noticed that our arts grantees are beginning to reject the nonprofit model. They feel that it's a very restrictive model for them because what so often happens with nonprofits is it's founded by a person or a group of people who are really passionate about a cause, and they are pushing forward with this cause, and then they have to raise money, and ultimately the raising money part of it gets in the way of actually doing the work, and they get very frustrated by that because they're not actually pursuing their passion anymore. They're only pursuing the money that enables somebody else to push the cause forward. So I think there's some interesting options when it comes to, you could be fiscally sponsored, and in the US, I mean, I don't know if this is true everywhere or not. I apologize for sort of not having that knowledge, but like you can have a fiscal sponsor who sort of is the tax, holds the nonprofit status for you. They do a lot of the administrative back office work for you, but it allows you to collect charitable donations without you having to deal with setting up a board and doing all the things you have to do to comply with your tax status. I was at the session this morning on cooperatives, which I thought was really interesting. There's a really, I think, important conversation to be had about ownership of local media, and the cooperative model I think is really interesting. And there's another, we have one site in New Jersey that's a for-profit and is also fiscally sponsored. So they're a hybrid. So they are like a little local business, but they have found a way to accept those charitable donations that, there are some people out in the world that don't want to give $10 to a local for-profit site, but if you give them an option to give $10 through their fiscal sponsor, they'll do it that way for the tax donations. So I think that's actually a really nice balance for a lot of local sites, is to just be the for-profit site that finds a way to have the to get the donations. One other thing I want to mention, just being the funder on the panel, one of the questions that Andrea asked us to think about is, in terms of nonprofit versus for-profit, how do you avoid influence from funders? This is something that I think about a lot, especially when we started this program at Dodge, and we were trying to figure out what's the best way to spend our money, what's the best way to sort of dip our toe in this water, and I think we realized pretty quickly that we didn't want any influence over the coverage, which is not true of all foundations. There are definitely foundations out there who fund journalism as a strategy to promote their agenda. That is very real, but we didn't want that. For us, it was really very much about trying to build up the news ecosystem in New Jersey, and so I always say to other funders, consider funding operating support, like just do help with capacity building and infrastructure, and so long as you're not funding content, you'll never have the appearance or the perception of trying to influence coverage, and that I think is a really important rule that funders should live by, even though they don't all live by that. So I'll stop there. And
Thank you. It's an honor for me to have here among the speakers Scott Klein, Deputy Managing Editor of ProPublica, because ProPublica is a milestone for deep investigative and data journalism, and so I'm very curious to hear from Scott his point of view. Molly told us that there's a problem of scale. She studied the local model. According to a survey from American Press Institute, 4 non-profit organizations in 10 are local. And I want to ask to Scott the point of view of a national, of an international company, a media outlet, non-profit media outlet like ProPublica.
Sure. Hi, everybody. Something I haven't had a chance to do yet is to not only thank Andrea for asking me to be on the panel, but to thank the IJF for having me here in Italy. So a couple of things. First, at ProPublica, we're very serious about keeping the journalism and the funding separate. So I'm going to talk a bit about my knowledge sort of from the point of view of somebody in the newsroom who actually, I don't have a lot of internal knowledge. Oh, sorry. Is that better? As I was saying, we keep the journalism and the funding separate. I'm going to talk about what it feels like to work at a nonprofit newsroom inside the newsroom, but I don't do any of the fundraising myself, and maybe that's an interesting point of view, but it is the one that I know, so that's convenient. When ProPublica started, I was at a for-profit newsroom. It was the oldest continuously published magazine in the country. It was founded in 1865. We were technically a for-profit, but we hadn't made a profit in 50 years. So I was very familiar with the nonprofit model. I was very comfortable coming to ProPublica, and I wasn't all that worried. I kind of knew how long a company could stick around, even if they didn't make any money. But back in 2008, the news industry in the U.S. was a real bummer. It was a really sad time. There were so many newspaper closings, and there were so many layoffs that there was a blog called Paper Cuts, which is sort of a pun on kind of like on cutting yourself on paper, but also cutting people from the paper. And every day they just published how many people had been laid off, and naming all of them and it was terrible. And so that was kind of how bad things were. Things have stabilized a little since then. But that was the kind of environment that ProPublica was born in. And ProPublica was founded when Paul Steiger, who was then the executive editor of the Wall Street Journal, was asked by a wealthy man named Herb Sandler. What Herb asked was, what is the part of news that most needs saving? You know, if news is collapsing and we may see whole cities without any newspapers at all, what is the part that we need to save first? You know, almost like a sinking ship. And what Paul said was the thing that is most in danger is the really expensive journalism. The stories that take a year, the stories that take a year and a half, or the ones that require a lot of flying and a lot of legal help and a lot of, the investigative stories. And the investigative stories are really the parts of newspapers that are the most likely to have impact in their communities, to save people's lives, to improve the quality of the schools, to improve the quality of the hospitals, to keep corruption out of town hall and things like that. And so what Herb did was he and Paul founded ProPublica together to be a place where investigative journalism can thrive, no matter what happened to the economic environment. And something that I want to echo something that Molly said, because I think it's exactly right. Then our troubles began, right? Then we had to, it was a $10 million original grant, and then we had fundraising people who were remarkable, who then had to kind of raise that money every year. So ProPublica, we've been very fortunate. We've been able to make that budget every year, and actually much more since 2008. But that is the world in which we were created. One of the things that Andrea asked me to think about, and I want to talk about for a second here, is whether this can scale. Now, we are about 40 people, 40 reporters in the newsroom, maybe another 6 or 7 editors. And we will add at least another 20 in the next few years, in part because we are expanding the operation to have an Illinois office in Chicago covering Illinois. So that's, maybe, what did I say, maybe 50, 55, 60 people in the newsroom. That is very small relative to even a small newspaper. But when you think that we are only the investigative part of the newsroom, we're really quite big. So the New York Times has about 20 reporters in their investigative unit. And so we have a multiple of that. So can we scale? Maybe we can't scale as large as, an entire huge newsroom that has a sports section and a theater section and a national desk and a foreign desk and things like that. But I think that by focusing on something, by focusing on investigative news, I think we have been able to do quite a lot. So.
Okay, thank you. There's one thing that impressed me. I call it a piece of business model, because it's based on the idea that data and data sets are profitable.
Sure.
Can you explain it?
Sure. So to be specific of what I do at ProPublica, so I run the data teams. So we have teams that do data journalism and that build interactive journalism with our data. And we also help all of the reporters in the newsroom who are working on data projects. And so what Andrea is talking about is a project that I started and has since been taken over by our business development manager, in which we take the data sets that we create for our news stories and for our interactive maps and things, and we license them commercially. So one of the things we realized was that, if it took us 6 months to prepare a raw data set for publication, that we were, in fact, putting a lot of value into them. We were making valuable things, and that it would be just as difficult for a commercial business to do that as it was for us to do that. There's nothing sort of magical about a commercial business that, they could do it cheaper than we could. It's expensive for everybody to do this. And so we had these data sets that had gone through a very rigorous set of steps to prepare them for journalism. And we realized that there might be a market there, and that commercial businesses, healthcare companies, insurance companies, researchers, analysts might be able to take that data, kind of merge it with their own private data, and to be able to make some money off of it. And we thought there might be a chance for us to create what's called in the nonprofit community in America earned income, which is money that you make that doesn't come in through charitable means. So it was a way for us to help defray the costs, especially of my team, and it's done very well. I think, in fact, it is one path for any newsroom that does a lot of data journalism. So that's what Andrea's doing.
Thank you. Phoebe Arnold is from Full Fact, and so she is the round table knight. We all need fact checkers now. I think that every journalist should be a fact checker, but it seems like we need a specific type of journalism in fact checking. And fact checking is one thing that people ask for, and maybe is willing to pay for. And so would you please explain what are you doing and how are you funding?
Sure. So Full Fact is the UK's independent fact-checking charity. We've been going for about 7 years. And probably what you're most interested in is how we're funded, so I'll explain that first. The main thing to say is that we have a big mix of funding with no particular strategy except that it's mixed. So we started off with a charitable trust called JRCT, Joseph Rowntree Charitable Trust, who gave us, I think, £10,000. And then our chairman, who is a Conservative Party donor, so he's on the right of the political spectrum, who gave us, I think, £50,000 to start, and that was in 2010. And since then, we've added quite a lot of charitable trusts to our mix. The biggest one now is the Nuffield Foundation, which funds a lot of social science research in the UK. We also have about 350 individual donors who give us about £10 a month each. We also make money from earned income, so data consulting, big research projects, that kind of thing. And then we also recently started adding corporate support to the mix. So the biggest drinks company, Diageo, Heineken fund us, the City of London Corporation, a trade union. And again, with those people, it's really important for us to have a mix so that people can see that we're not being influenced by them in any way. The next thing to say is probably that on the kind of influence side, what we're selling normally is a vision, and it's our independence. So rather than promising people a certain number of fact checks or that we'll fact check particular topics, we are selling them our reputation. We've never actually had a funder try and influence any of our fact checks or what we monitor or what we conclude, which I think is probably very lucky. But I think we've always been quite clear from the start that it's the vision of accurate public debate that we're selling. And yeah, I think echoing what Molly said about funders, funding capacity, and kind of core support is definitely, from our perspective, the best thing as well, to have kind of core grants where there's no influence on what we're trying to check. I think that the other important thing to say is that we're a charity. So we were set up as a charity, which in the UK gives you quite a lot of legal obligations. First of all, for us, it's that we're an educational charity. It actually took us 4 years to get charitable status, which we didn't expect, but I think that our director didn't go about it in the right way in the first place, so that's why it took so long. But that means that we, by law, have to be impartial and balanced. We have to do all our research accurately, obviously, because we're fact checkers, but that's within our constitution as well. But it also gives us quite a lot of benefits. So I was interested to hear your perspective on the benefits of being a non-profit. So in the UK, if you're a charity, you get to pay less in business rates. You can get free advertising from Google, kind of Google AdWords. And you can apply for a wider range of charitable trusts. So for us, it was really important. And then there's the kind of obvious benefit of people having quite a lot of trust for charities. So now we can say we're a charity, and that gives us kind of extra kudos. As I kind of hinted at the beginning, our funding is kind of quite a hodgepodge with, yeah, as I said, the only strategy being that we have a mix of funding always. So I'm not sure it's really a model that others would necessarily be able to follow. And I also think that we're the biggest recipient of this type of funding in the UK. I think that the new markets for us will be individual donors rather than charitable trusts. So at least one of the trusts that funds us is funding as much as they can now or forever, which is about £75,000. Yeah. So, yeah, but I think the big thing that I was thinking about before I came here was I think that journalism, at least in the UK, needs to sell itself more as a charitable activity. So I think the Charity Commission's had quite a lot of conversations about journalism being a public benefit, and I don't think they're quite there yet, but I think this is something that funders and journalists and everyone who cares about journalism in the UK needs to persuade them of, that journalism is a charitable activity and that it needs charitable funding to continue.
Thank you. A question for all of you. What do you think about big digital companies funding journalism? I mean, if they come in the game with millions of dollars, does it change the environment? Is it a good news? Is it a bad news? Or it depends? Who wants to go first?
So we have funding from Google, which is from their Digital News Initiative Fund, which I think is meant to encourage innovation and sustainability in journalism. So we have prototype funding for our automated fact-checking work, which I think I wasn't actually involved in the funding pitch for it, but I think it was kind of based on the idea that journalism is losing trust and that fact-checking, by making it easier for journalists to provide accurate information and to fact-check themselves, that they would be kind of increasing trust in journalism. I don't think we would not take funding from Facebook, but I would be very wary of taking it unless we knew the terms on which we were taking it. So, you know, they've got this fact-checking pilot at the moment that they're doing in the US and in Germany and France. As I understand it, I think you'd have to ask them, but I think that they're paying those fact-checkers. which I think is right. Fact-checking is a really, really expensive thing to do, kind of like what Scott was saying. It involves hours and hours of research and a lot of specialist skill and really good connections to experts. So I don't think that Full Fact as a charity should be giving Facebook and getting nothing in return. I think that our supporters would be quite annoyed about that.
Scott?
We have a financial relationship with Google. Google funded, I was sort of sponsored a project that I did last year called Election Land, and they were part of the project as well. So, I mean, again, I'm not in the fundraising part, so I think that there are challenges, but I think that they can be overcome like any. It's a personal opinion.
Oh, okay. Yeah. And from a founder point of view?
From a funder's perspective, I mean, I think, those big publishing companies present the exact same challenges that you would have from any other funder that may seem questionable to others, or big advertisers that may seem questionable. And so, I think you have to have your own internal policies around what kind of money you're willing to accept and what money you're not willing to accept, and try to be as transparent as possible about it. I mean, I think that transparency is so important. One of the things that the Knight Foundation does that I really appreciate is they sort of stipulate as part of their grant agreement to news organizations that those news organizations have to publish any gift. I think it's $5,000. Any gift that they receive over $5,000. They have to be transparent about that on their websites. And I think that's a really valuable way for a funder to push that transparency issue. So I think it's all sort of the part of the same thing there. You have to be clear about what you're willing to do and what you're not willing to do, and be transparent about it.
And on the other hand, on the other side, as I said before, there's microfunding from citizens, from people. And why do you think that after Trump election, this kind of funding rised up, and this is a signal of what?
I think it's almost self-evident, right? I think that so Trump's election was something of a shock, especially to people who aren't on his side of the political fence, and I think that they were looking to do something, and they were kind of looking for a place that they could invest some money, put in some money to help make sure that the facts are, make sure that the facts come out, make sure that the administration is investigated, and that is the business that we are in. And I think that we had shown over the, I guess, 8 years that we had been in business up to that point, just 6 months ago or whatever, 3 months ago, that we were, because we were in the facts business and the investigating business, we were the place that made the most sense to put in some of that money. So we've done very well in small dollar donors especially, and we are expanding that operation since the election. We were helped because we were mentioned by John Oliver. Do people know who he is? John Oliver, a TV host, sort of a funny news show on HBO on Sunday nights, mentioned us as a place that was going to be doing a lot of investigations, and people should give money, and that made a lot of people give us money. Yeah. So
it was a boost.
What's that? It was actually a very big boost. But it was, I think people, I think on some level, philanthropic giving, personal philanthropic giving is often, it's counter-cyclical. So, they sort of give money to the opposite people than they perceive who are in power. And I can tell you personally, again, the place I worked that was founded in 1865 was from the left, and ProPublica is not from the left. ProPublica is very much in the center and very much objective politically, but I think that people felt that this was a place to kind of put their money because Trump came into power because of this kind of counter-cyclical phenomenon.
Is there a sort of willingness to save journalists and journalism?
I don't know. I do think that that our presidential election has galvanized people, for sure. It's certainly galvanized funders. I think there's a huge opportunity right now to bring more funders into the space. And if I were a news organization, I would be spending a lot of time thinking about the best way to attract new funders in this moment. I don't know that I would frame it as saving journalism. I'm not sure that that's a compelling pitch, but right now is a really important time that we're seeing a lot of money flow into journalism in a good way, and I hope it continues. We'll see.
Yeah. And the last question I want to ask you before to leave the audience is if the media industry should fall, and can we imagine a future of journalism without media industry, without publishers, or it's something too much weird?
I mean, we're a publisher, so I mean, you mean without kind of a big publisher?
Yeah, a commercial publisher.
I don't think so. So Clay Shirky, who's at NYU, said something that resonated with me, and I remember nothing may work, but everything might. And so I think that if, even with the kind of wholesale collapse of news, I think there will always be room for lots of different models. I think, look, the New York Times has 2 million digital subscribers. They are making money. They are profitable on their digital subscribers. I think that there will always be room for for-profit journalism, for non-profit journalism, for, there's also like a less profit, what do they call that?
Like
no,
the public benefit corporations?
There's a public benefit corporations where
Yeah.
they're not nonprofits, but they're not they're not fiduciarily, they're not financially required to make money, right? So these is the kind of third option, and yet models as yet unknown, right? There's public radio is doing very well in the U.S. right now. So I think that we will go from what was once, giant corporations extracting monopoly rents from department stores, which is really kind of what newspapers were for 50 years. To smaller, mixes of news organizations. So you'll have cities with maybe a big newspaper and a couple of TV stations, and then lots of little nonprofits and kind of nonprofits and for-profit organizations kind of targeting niches, and I think that's a good thing.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I would add to that too. Like, I'm constantly amazed in New Jersey by how many citizens step up to cover the news in their communities, to sort of voluntarily cover town hall meetings and Board of Education meetings. I mean, there are so many people who want to step in and fill those gaps, and will do it even if it's just volunteering to do it. So I do think that there are, even in the face of, I hope there's not a big collapse, but if there is, I do think that there are opportunities to come up with other models, and you'll see that people are really driven to participate and contribute to their communities.
Phoebe?
Yeah, I think there's kind of one more point. It's not directly answering your question, but it's something that I think applies to journalists and also people who produce official information, so statisticians, I think, and to full fact and fact checkers. I think explaining how you do your work is a good way of getting people to understand the value. So I don't know what you guys think or what any of the audience thinks, but I don't feel like I particularly, before I worked in this field, understood how much time and effort and skill goes into producing investigative journalism or fact-checking or any kind of journalism, like all the sub-editing and everything, and like, how much time it takes to find pictures, like all of that stuff. And I think it's kind of maybe about trust as well. So I think in one of the panels I was in earlier, we were talking about official sources of information being less trusted. And I was saying, I think one of the ways that that can change is if people explain, statisticians, for example, explain how they make migration statistics. Because once you know that, you're much more likely to trust what those statistics tell you. So I think there's kind of analogous point here about journalists explaining how they do their jobs, kind of like that Al Jazeera video you were talking about earlier.
Yeah.
Maybe you could explain.
It's a sort of gamification of made from Al Jazeera English. I saw yesterday. It's sort of gamification of they call hacked, and it's a news investigation over Syrian Electronic Army, and the user and then the reader is involved deep in the investigation, and he can do some choices, and if you want to speak with hackers, or if you want to check if if a virus has infected his phone, and he's interacting with the news, but it's news, it's journalism, and it's very, very impressive. Yes, it's a new way to do journalism, but it's not very profitable at the moment. So we want to continue this conversation with you, and I think there's a microphone in the room, so please feel free to ask your question.
Hi, thank you. My question was to Scott. And you mentioned election land before, and I know that at ProPublica you cover data journalism. Do you think that data, for its collaborative and for its inherent quality, is naturally like an easier way to go into non-profit journalism? Because a lot of like citizen journalists or smaller realities, like we were talking about when we were talking about New Jersey, can work on that and maybe rebrand it or sell it like you people do at ProPublica? Thank you.
I agree with Molly. I think that nonprofit journalism is not an easier way of doing anything. It's sort of difficult. It's a challenge always. And you know, raising money charitably, I think is perceived as somehow less work than selling advertising, but it may be more work. I mean, it's a lot of work. However, I love data journalism. I think everyone should do data journalism. I think that there are incredible opportunities in data journalism to do just good journalism. And a point that I wanted to make before and that I forgot, and I will kind of slot in now, what I love about being a nonprofit journalist is that we have found a way, right? So like I said, 50 years, essentially what news was people with a monopoly charging whatever they wanted to department stores for advertising. And that was sort of like the way that newspapers worked for a long, long time. And it didn't matter if they did good journalism or bad journalism. They could still charge the department stores a lot of money to put their ads in the newspaper, and they were profitable. So that world is gone. And what nonprofit journalism, the real promise that nonprofit journalism has, and data journalism especially, is that we are able to, it's an economic thing, we are able to tie the quality of our journalism to how much money we make. The better our journalism, the more money we make. And that is not the model of for-profit journalism, at least it wasn't in history, right? We have to be good. And what of our, like I said, I'm in the newsroom, so I don't go and ask people for money. But what our fundraisers tell us is we can't make money if we have nothing to sell. You have to give us great journalism to bring to funders and to people and say, look at the great work we did. Your investment can help us make more of this. And so whether it's great data journalism or great not data journalism or great video journalism or great whatever journalism, the better the journalism we do, the easier it is to raise money from charities, charitably.
The mic.
Thank you. My question is also to Scott. So about selling your data, I was very curious. At the golden age of data blog, they always had to get the data at the bottom, and that is kind of a standard for data journalism, to be open data journalism, right? So did the dilemma, or were you thinking whether you should publish data for public to access or you should monetize it? Because recently journalists, when being asked why don't you provide access to data, they say, well, it's so huge and it involves so many hours of work to clean the whole database that it's just impossible to be sure in every cell. That's why we don't publish it.
I mean, well, two things. One, most of our data sets are free. And certainly if a data set, if we just get it from a Freedom of Information request and use it and then put it on our website, we don't charge for it. It's actually, as you say, so it's the data sets that we spent months, cleaning and understanding and giving and adding other data to it. Those are the ones that we charge money for. And just want to make sure I understand your question. So one of the things is, we are incredibly diligent in how we clean our data, incredibly diligent in how we check our data. They come with licenses. All data is imperfect. What's the expression? All data is wrong, but some data is useful. They come with kind of standard kind of legal, non-warranties and things like that. But also, we have multiple licenses for our data as well. So if your question is sort of about the kind of charitable mission of our data and whether we are making sure that our data is being useful as a mission, from a mission perspective, we have multiple licenses for our data as well. So if you're a news organization, you pay a lot less. If you're an academic researcher, you pay a little bit more. And if you're a commercial client who's going to use it for, you're going to make money on our data, then you pay a bit more than that. So.
Here. Two. I just have a very short comment to address something that I heard and then a question. The comment, I think there was some discussion about whether it's a good appeal to just say, give us money for journalism because journalism is important and everything else. I'm from Canada, where journalism is fast collapsing in front of our eyes. We're a bit behind the US in that happening, but it's happening. And I work in part I write a column for an online site who's done a lot of crowdfunding. The crowdfunding about give us money because we're important, it's good for democracy, doesn't get them really any money at all. What they've done well is crowdfund around specific things. So we're going to send a reporter to the tar sands to report on their dirty oil. People send money. We're going to send a reporter to Ottawa to catch Stephen Harper doing bad things. People send money. But people don't, from our experience, just send money because it's a feel-good thing to help democracy. My question is to the notion of, I think it was you, Molly, who said that you advise people to fund operations and not content. I don't think, and I'm just interested in your comments on this, that's necessarily as clean a separation as it sounds, because having run a non-profit organisation before I got back into journalism recently for many years, if somebody decides to stop funding your operations, then you're not going to be producing any content for very long. So I don't think it's quite as clean a break as you made it sound.
No, I totally agree with you. I think influence works in extremely subtle ways. But just to, I was really commenting on to address the perception out in the world of if you're a funder who wants to fund journalism and you want to avoid the perception that you are heavily influencing, or not even heavily, but influencing the actual content, the best way to accomplish that is to fund operations versus content. But I totally agree with you that it works in very subtle ways, and there's nothing you can do about that. There's no way to there's no way to work around that. That power dynamic of a funder over the nonprofit is always going to be there, no matter how. We spend a lot of time talking to our grantees, inviting them to tell us what's working, what's not working. We make it very, very clear that we're not going to punish them if they've failed at something. And we make it really clear not to sugarcoat things because we can't help them if we don't know the truth. But that power dynamic is always there. There's absolutely nothing you can do about it. But I appreciate you saying that, because you're right. It works in very subtle ways.
Yeah, I mean, investigative journalists have a long history of biting the hand that feeds them. So I think we benefit from that. So Google sponsored this project that I did and gave us and funded our participation in it. And I think we published 3 stories about Google, very critical stories about Google, while that was going on, or in the year before that was going on. So in a way, we sort of have this built-in kind of mechanism. But we also won't take money for stories. We'll take money for topics, but if somebody comes to us and says, we'd like you to do a story about that go and get Stephen Harper or go and get Donald Trump, we wouldn't take it.
Thanks for the fascinating discussion. There's been some ideas floated around at conferences like this about platform tax on big platforms, on the basis that advertising is essentially subsidised democracy through accountability mechanism of journalism for 100 years, and the advertising model has essentially been decoupled from journalism by the big platforms. So my question to the panel is, one, do you think the idea has merit? And second, do you have any solutions to the big flaw in that, in how any revenue from such a platform tax would be distributed and how that's potentially funding impartial, accountable journalism?
This is not like a big increased taxes moment in America right now.
Yeah.
So that is like science fiction. I have no, it's not going to happen.
In Europe is a little bit different.
Yeah, I don't know how that would be administrated and who would decide how much tax the platforms would pay and which platforms would pay. Yeah, maybe, but I can't immediately see how it would work. Yeah. I think making, I don't know, you probably have opinions about the Google D&I fund, but I think making big funds available to support innovation in journalism is a really good thing. Yeah. Regardless of what you think of the company doing it.
We applied for D&I twice, and we won a D&I last, then the second D&I.
I don't think I have anything to add to that. It's not really my area of expertise.
Other questions? Okay. So thank you for coming again. Thank you to Scott, to Phoebe, and to Molly for being here with us. And thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. For local journalism sites around New Jersey. It's available to any New Jersey journalist. It doesn't matter, if you're a you're a journalist in a for-profit newsroom or a nonprofit. It's like they're the hotline that you call if you get a letter from a lawyer and you don't know what to do, or if you need some other kind of referral. So we spent a lot of time building up that center in order to help the entire news ecosystem. And we've also done a lot of experimentation around business models. In partnership with the Knight Foundation, we spent a lot of time really digging deep into what are the daily challenges of these small sites, what keeps them from all the different things, what keeps them from being able to establish new revenue streams, what eats up all of their time. There's a whole lot of sort of human behavior that comes into play here around time management and also being willing to commit to new things, a lot of aversion to risk when you're at such a tiny site and you have very limited resources. So we've spent a lot of time digging into that. We wrote, my colleague Josh Stearns and I wrote a big report about it last year called Lessons Learned from...
Do we really have something to sell? According to a survey from Ipsos Mori called Veracity Index, hairdressers are far more trustworthy than journalists. So Houston, we have a problem. What we try to do today is try to find a solution. After Trump election and before going to war, in the US, there was a boost of funding for nonprofit media organization. People realized that a trustworthy news ecosystem is crucial for democracy and decided to activate, to give help, just like we do for environment NGOs or food emergency or homeless people. A couple of days ago, if I am right, eBay founder Piero Media committed a $100 million grant to fight the so-called fake news. So is there a light in the dark? Is the non-profit model the future of journalism? Is non-profits...
To people, a lot of them are journalists who were downsized from a newspaper who went off to start their own site. Some of them are citizens who felt like there was nobody covering their town, and so they stepped up to do it. But by and large, the vast majority of news sources in our state are just these very tiny sites. And so one of the things I want to make sure that I'm clear about is that when I talk about local journalism and business models, I think it's really important to be very precise about scale. I'm not talking about business models for a national newspaper or national television. It's really these very tiny sites and the challenges that they run into every single day. So we've given some support directly to sites in New Jersey, but a lot of what we do is support capacity building for these sites. We helped establish something called the Center for Cooperative Media. It's at a university called Montclair State University, and their whole role in New Jersey is to provide all of the to provide services and training and support for
sustainable on a large scale. And how could we avoid potential influence from founders or members of a subscription-based community should they have voices in the editorial choices? These are some questions for our speakers today. First, I leave the stage to Molly de Aguiar from the Geraldine Dodge Foundation. In her researches, Molly compared nonprofit and for-profit models, focusing in particular on local news environment. So let's listen to what she has found.
Thank you, Andrea. It's such a pleasure to be here, so thank you all for joining us this evening. My name is Molly De Aguiar. I'm a program director with a small private foundation in New Jersey, and we focus statewide on a number of program areas. We fund arts, education, environment, and my program area is called Informed Communities, where we have spent the last 5 or 6 years really building up the infrastructure for local journalism in New Jersey. New Jersey's news landscape is dominated by very small digital newsrooms.
For coming, it's been a long and dramatic day with news breaking from Syria and from Stockholm. So thank you for your time, for your attention here at this discussion. My name is Andrea Iannuzzi. I work for Gruppo Editoriale L'Espresso in Italy, which is a for-profit company struggling with revenues like everybody else in the media environment does. Richard Gingras just said that news is what citizens need to be good citizens. But we can't sell news anymore. As a matter of fact, I think that we never sold news. What we were selling was packaging and delivery. When packaging and delivery were core business because people needed them. We can sell ads in the way Google and Facebook do. And when we try to do it, people block them on their browsers. Can we sell trust? Does trust have an economic value? If the answer is yes, and I don't know if the answer is yes, I hope our speakers could help us to find an answer to this question. So if the answer is yes, are we ready to sell trust?